OG CoreTalk is the channel where we turn multi-hour brain-melting talks into clear, actionable ideas you can actually use. If you want to save time while going deeper, subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next breakdown. I'll also remind you at the end of this summary to subscribe if this video helped you see Jordan Peterson's work in a new light. This video is the first lecture in Jordan B. Peterson's Psychological Significance of the Biblical Stories series, Biblical Series 1, Introduction to the Idea of God. Over more than 2.5 hours, Peterson lays out why he takes the Bible seriously, what he means by God, and how ancient stories encode crucial psychological and cultural knowledge rather than simple superstition. He mixes philosophy, depth psychology, mythology, evolution, and personal clinical experience to argue that these stories are best understood as deep, layered maps of human experience. Why bother with the Bible at all? Peterson opens by asking the obvious question, why even study an ancient contradictory book like the Bible in the 21st century? He notes that the Bible has outlived empires, shaped entire civilizations, and remains inexplicably durable, more durable than stone, castles, and empires, which suggests it encodes something fundamental about human life. He frames the biblical narratives as attempts across millennia to make sense of mysteries we still don't fully understand: the nature of consciousness, the structure of meaning, human evil, and social order. Rather than treating Scripture as primitive science, he treats it as a record of humanity's long struggle to understand itself through stories, rituals, and symbols. Nietzsche, God's Death and the Danger of Ideology. Peterson spends a large chunk of the lecture on Nietzsche's claim that God is dead. He explains that Nietzsche didn't celebrate this as a victory, but saw it as a catastrophe. Once the Christian metaphysical foundation is removed, Western civilization risks collapsing into nihilism or being captured by murderous political ideologies. Nietzsche predicted that without the old religious framework, the 20th century would see hundreds of millions of deaths as people replaced religion with rigid, pseudo-rational ideologies, something Peterson connects directly to the horrors of Nazism, Stalinism, and Maoism. Later, he draws on Jung and Dostoevsky to argue that when people abandon deep religious narratives, they don't become calm rationalists. Instead, they gravitate toward crippled religions, like totalizing political ideologies. Dreams, myths, and the unconscious. A core idea of the lecture is that myths grow out of dreams, and dreams are the birthplace of thought. Drawing heavily on Jung, Peterson argues that humans know more than they can clearly articulate. We act, feel, and dream in structured ways long before we can explain what we're doing. He suggests that over thousands of years, people watched one another act, told stories about those actions, and gradually distilled recurring patterns into myths, religious images, and archetypes. Dreams are where the unknown first appears in symbolic form. Myths and religious stories are repeated, refined dreams of the culture that encode lessons about how to live, cooperate, love, and face chaos. Peterson rejects the idea that dreams are random noise from the brain. Instead, he views them as simulations where the psyche experiments with new ways of organizing experience and confronting fears, often focusing on anxiety and unresolved conflicts. He points out that psychotherapy often advances when patients interpret dreams, gaining insights they didn't know they knew. The problem of interpretation and postmodernism. Peterson acknowledges a key postmodern insight. Complex texts like the Bible or Shakespeare allow endless interpretations, and the same is true of reality itself. But he argues postmodernists make a fatal error when they conclude no interpretation is better than any other. He says our interpretations are constrained by three things: our own long-term well-being, you can't adopt beliefs that make life unbearable; other people, you must be able to live and cooperate with them; and the real world, if an interpretation leads you to jump off a bridge, it gets falsified quickly.
Because of these constraints, only a narrow band of interpretations actually work over time. So the question becomes, which stories and value systems help people suffer less, remain sane, and build workable societies? For Peterson, the biblical canon survives precisely because it has passed that brutal selection test. Morality, suffering, and the need for a noble aim. Peterson insists that human beings cannot live without a meaningful aim. We experience positive emotion not mainly when we achieve a goal, but when we see ourselves moving towards something worthwhile. Once we reach a goal, the positive emotion quickly collapses unless a new aim appears. Life is inherently full of suffering, limitation, and death, so shallow goals and short-term pleasures are not enough to sustain people. Without a noble aim, people become desperate, cynical, and easy prey for destructive ideologies. He ties this back to biblical themes. The stories are obsessed with the question, how should we live, rather than scientific questions about what the world is made of. From this angle, morality is not mere social convention. It's a set of practices and ideals that minimize needless suffering over time, for you, your future self, and the people around you. The noble aim is the bread you cannot live without. God as abstraction of the ideal. Peterson begins unpacking what God might mean, especially in early Genesis. He suggests that ancient people started by noticing that certain individuals embodied desirable traits, strength, courage, fairness, leadership, and then abstracted a pattern from those individuals to form an ideal. Over time, tribes with different ideals had to coexist and negotiate, producing higher-level, more universal abstractions. In Mesopotamia, this process produced gods like Marduk, a deity elected by other gods to defeat chaos, Tiamat, and create an ordered world. Marduk's defining traits, eyes all around his head, and the ability to speak magic words, symbolize hyper-vigilant attention and powerful, truthful speech to transform chaos into habitable order. Peterson interprets this myth as an early recognition that leadership requires two core capacities: seeing clearly, conscious attention, and speaking truthfully to transform chaos into habitable order. He argues that the biblical God shares these attributes and becomes, over time, an abstraction of the highest possible ideal, the principle that even kings must serve, the sovereignty of sovereignty itself. Logos, Genesis, and consciousness as world-creating. To prepare for Genesis 1, Peterson turns to the beginning of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, Logos. He links logos to consciousness and speech, the capacity to perceive, categorize, and verbally shape reality. He proposes that from the biblical perspective, reality as we experience it is not just matter, it's matter plus conscious experience and meaning, and consciousness plays a constitutive role. Being, in this sense, requires a subject to whom things matter. Being, in this sense, requires a subject to whom things matter. God, speaking the world into being, is a symbolic way of saying that order, value, and experience come into existence through attention and articulated word. This connects to the idea that humans are made in the image of God. Our ability to attend, imagine the future, speak, and transform the world through our actions mirrors, in miniature, the creative logos. That's also the philosophical root of Western ideas about individual rights and dignity. Our legal systems implicitly treat each person as bearing something inviolable and quasi-divine: consciousness, agency, and moral responsibility. Trinitarian hints and attributes of the divine. Near the end, Peterson sketches how Christian Trinitarian language, Father, Son, Spirit, can be understood psychologically rather than only metaphysically. Roughly, Father corresponds to tradition, the structure of law, culture, and the transcendent ideal that judges individuals and states alike. Son corresponds to the ideal individual, the hero who voluntarily confronts suffering, speaks truth, and redeems chaos. Ultimate example, Christ. Spirit corresponds to the inner voice of conscience and the shared human capacity to embody and recognize truth, beauty, and love. He lists a long cloud of metaphors for God, a judge who punishes and forgives, a source of law, a being with whom you can make a covenant, sacrifice now for a better future, the tragic victim and redeemer, the enemy of deceit, the burning yet unconsuming fire, and the blinding light. For him, these metaphors are multiple glimpses of the same underlying ideal that humans have been triangulating towards for thousands of years.
Phenomenology, the Bible as map of lived experience. Peterson emphasizes that he is not reading the Bible as primitive science, but as phenomenology, an attempt to describe how life is actually experienced from the inside. Cosmological details like the ancient three-tiered universe, dome, waters, underworld, mix observation with imagination, but the deeper truths concern fear, hope, sacrifice, justice, love, betrayal, and meaning. He argues that dismissing this material as just superstition is intellectually shallow and historically ignorant. The Bible is more like a compressed, hyperlinked library of moral, psychological, and social experiments that have been remembered precisely because they resonated with how humans really are. The lecture ends just as Peterson is about to comment directly on Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. Having spent nearly the entire session setting up conceptual tools, Nietzsche, Jung, dreams, myth, Marduk, logos, phenomenology, to read that line in a richer way. He says his goal for the whole series is not to preach dogma, but to see whether these ancient stories still contain something we actually need to face suffering without collapsing into nihilism or tyranny. If this OG CoreTalk summary saved you hours and gave you a clearer grip on Jordan Peterson's biblical lectures, remember to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with someone who wants depth without sitting through 2 hours and 38 minutes.